Welcome to a new channel, History for the HSC, a channel that endeavours to provide deep dives into syllabus content for HSC Modern History and HSC Ancient History. This channel is supposed to help you in your revision and your study for your HSC to help prepare you for your learning throughout the year. In this first video, we will be looking at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. This is part of the HSC Modern History Power and Authority topic, the core study of the HSC. This is our first video, so the rest of our videos will be developed later on, but we do hope you find this useful in your study and your preparation for your HSC. So let's start by breaking down this topic into the 4 components that we are going to use in order to better understand what we need to know. We start with considering the Armistice, the end of the war. How did that occur? What were the events surrounding it? And what implications does that have for our study of power and authority in the modern world? We will then consider the Paris Peace Conference as a whole, but largely focusing in on the role of the Big Five. Following on, we will consider the treaties that were signed with all of the powers, not just the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, but the other treaties that were signed and how they impacted the various nations. And lastly, we will consider the impact of the Paris Peace Conference and the treaties on various nations and how this set up the world that was the interwar period. Now, slightly earlier, the Allies had already signed agreements with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. They were not able to continue fighting for as long. They were even worse affected by the war than Germany. However, by early November, the situation in Germany had gotten to the point where it was recognized by all levels an agreement would need to be made with the Allies in order to secure peace. So representatives from the German government were sent through the lines on a 10-hour trip to meet with French Field Marshal Foch in his train carriage on the outskirts of Paris. It was this train carriage which Hitler, some slightly over 20 years later, would humiliatingly force the French to surrender to the Germans in World War II as a sort of propaganda victory for the Nazi Party. To understand what is happening in this armistice, we need to do a little bit of background into what is occurring in Germany in late 1918. Germany is undergoing what is sometimes called the German Revolution of 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II, he has abdicated. A revolutionary government has come to power. They are left-leaning socialists, although not communist. They are seeking to form a kind of continuation of the government and recognize they need to keep both kind of sides of government on side, all instruments of government on side. However, there are groups within Germany that are seeking to take it further and are expecting a full communist revolution in Germany in much the same way as it occurred in Russia the year before. Regardless, these German diplomats arriving in Foch's railway carriage were not given a chance to negotiate the terms of the armistice. They were presented by General Foch a document to sign and told they had 72 hours to sign it. There was a small amount of negotiation that could occur and did occur, although that was only relating to certain stipulations that were just unfeasible. These largely had to do with how fast the Germans would retreat from certain areas and the recognition that it was going to take a bit longer in some cases. It wasn't that the Germans were trying to get out or win anything from this. They recognized they had lost. All parties within Germany recognized they had lost. In fact, from the General Chief of Staff, Paul von Hindenburg, to the Chancellor Friedrich Ebert, everyone in a position of power in Germany recognized the armistice needed to be signed. Hindenburg advised the government to sign whatever they were given. Germany was not in a position to fight any longer. Regardless, it is this signature from the government of Ebert, that first starts this myth of the stab in the back, which we'll see come to full fruition following the Treaty of Versailles. It's important to point out right from the outset, though, the signing of the armistice has full support from all leadership within Germany, both civilian and military. The armistice came into effect at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918. It had actually been signed earlier that morning, and there was about a 4-hour delay to it coming into effect. During that time, in many parts of the line, the fighting continued. In fact, the last recorded death of World War I occurred just a minute or so before 11 a.m., an American soldier sent to attack the Germans and dying in the process. From this point on, for the next 6 months, peace negotiations began at the Paris Peace Conference, in what Margaret Macmillan calls 6 months that changed the world. But around the world, on the 11th of November, at that point, celebrations, war was over. In America, in Australia, even in Germany, as troops returned home celebrating that war was over, although, of course, the return home for the Germans and the Austrians, the Bulgarians, was very different to what it was for the Allies who'd been victorious. And so we've seen the armistice. We've seen how the situation in Germany was at the point where peace needed to be agreed upon no matter what the terms. And the terms of the armistice were fairly reasonable. But the political situation in Germany was already problematic. And the fact that the armistice had been dictated to them as opposed to negotiated already spells problems for what is going to happen in the future Paris Peace Conference. Starting late 1919, 32 nations came together to negotiate together regarding peace at the end of World War I in what we call the Paris Peace Conference. It's often mistakenly called the Versailles Conference, after the most famous treaty that was negotiated there, the Treaty of Versailles. However, more than just one treaty was negotiated at the Paris Peace Conference. Notable absences from the Paris Peace Conferences included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union, along with nationalist China. Now, the countries that had lost the war were not invited, and this is going to be problematic because it will mean the terms of the treaty will be dictated to them and they will be forced to sign, and this in many ways creates problems as we move through our topic and we consider the implications this has, particularly in Germany. The Soviet Union is not invited, because the Allies do not recognize the Bolsheviks as the legitimate government of Russia. A civil war is still basically ongoing at this point. Regardless of the 32 nations engaged in this negotiation, there really are a big five. That is the USA, UK, France, Italy, and Japan, forming the major powers who are able to participate and vote in every discussion that is being had at the Paris Peace Conference. There is a second group which involves Commonwealth nations such as Australia and Canada, along with minor powers such as Belgium or Greece, who get to participate and negotiate in a lot, although not all of the various discussions that are being had. And then there is a third group involving countries who did not actually declare war on Germany, but did cut off diplomatic relations with them. These are countries like Peru. So let's take some time to consider what the various aims of the Big Five were at the Paris Peace Conference, and a little bit of time on how well they actually achieved those aims. Let us start with Japan and their Prime Minister Kinmochi. Japan had two aims at the Paris Peace Conference, the first of which was to gain control of German spheres of influence in China. These were areas of China that were under tacit German control following the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion within China. Japan presumed for their involvement in the war, they would get all of German holdings and maybe some other bits and pieces within China. The second consideration Japan desired was a recognition of racial equality to appear within the League of Nations. We will look at the League of Nations in a later video, but at this point, just understand that Japan wanted a recognition of racial equality within that document. Now let's take a little moment to consider these two requests. Particularly, let's start with the first one. Japan had fought Germany in World War I. However, it was realistically a fairly minor involvement. There'd been some clashes on Pacific Islands that Japan had taken off Germany, and there had been some clashes with German troops within China. However, realistically, Japan's involvement in the war paled into insignificance in comparison to any of the other big four, and realistically paled into insignificance in comparison to even minor powers such as Australia. Now, their recognition of racial equality, there were other reasons that failed, and we'll get to that later. But historians do debate somewhat why Japan is not able to gain its desires here. And they're sort of split. Perhaps it's because realistically Japan wasn't engaged in the war, and so to kind of demand much when they didn't put in much seems unreasonable. Or perhaps it was just the inherent racism of the European delegates. Now, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle and a bit of both, but it's actually important to understand that China, whom Japan wanted to take territory in after World War I, China had actually supported the Allies during the war, arguably to a greater extent than Japan did, though not through sending troops. They sent men, quite a substantial number of men, as a workforce to build railway tracks and a lot of the kind of infrastructure requirements and the background things that needed to happen during the war. And it's actually the fact that Japan gets anything here causes massive anger in China, leading to the May 4th movement and the growth of communism within China. Regardless, Japan comes out of the Paris Peace Conference quite annoyed and angry. They do not get what they want, and realistically, they weren't respected in the same way the other major powers were. In many respects, we can say it is not the Big Five, it is the Big Four. Look at this Big Four. Who they are, again, what are their aims and their ambitions. And we'll start with Italy and their Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando. Now, Italy had joined World War I following the secret Treaty of London, which they had signed. The Treaty of London promised Italy, in return for joining the war, land that formerly belonged to Austria-Hungary in the region of Dalmatia. Italy had a massive contribution to the war. 700,000 men died, 13 billion liras on the war, that far surmounted anything the government had spent on pretty much anything for the previous 30 years. However, Italy, much like Japan, is not successful in gaining their territorial ambitions during the Paris Peace Conference. And the main problem they had is that their territorial ambition came at odds with President Wilson of the United States' desire for national self-determination. Wilson believed that nations, ethnic groups, should be allowed to make decisions for themselves about their own governance. And whatever contribution Italy may have had to the war, the USA was in a stronger political position to ensure their will was followed. And Italy's failure here to achieve their territorial ambitions destroyed the political career of the Prime Minister Orlando. He resigned about a week or so out from the signing of the conference. His political career had been ruined. He had lost all popularity. And in fact, this severely weakened, we will see, the democracy in Italy. So it isn't the Big Five, it isn't the Big Four. In fact, what we need to understand is realistically the decisions at the Paris Peace Conference came down to the Big Three, to what the US, the French, and the British wanted. Let's start with what the US wanted. The USA were led at the conference by the President Woodrow Wilson. He was an idealist. He wanted what he described as peace without victory, for the defeated forces to be treated well, for national self-determination, for limiting arms, an international agreement to limit arms, for the establishment of a League of Nations and collective security to ensure war would not occur again. These are described in Wilson's 14 points in detail. Now, beyond that, what Wilson is trying to accomplish is to eliminate the basic causes of war. If people don't need to go to war, then they won't go to war, and we won't have a repeat of World War I. Where Wilson wanted peace without victory, where Wilson wanted to remove the root causes of war, our next contestant, Clemenceau of France, sought something very different. His desire at the Paris Peace Conference was to crush Germany. He had seen his nation invaded twice, actually, in the last 40 to 50 years, and he wanted to ensure a situation where Germany would never again be able to do that, to be able to accomplish that. And so his desire was to punish Germany most severely. He was disdainful of Wilson's 14 points, describing it like this: Wilson has 14 points, God Almighty has only 10. Now, this hatred and anger and desire to punish Germany comes from a reality that he has faced. France suffered far more in World War I than either Britain or the USA did. 1.4 million soldiers, about 3.4% of its population, died. And to the French, punishment needed to be meted out. It is important to understand that both Wilson of the USA and Clemenceau of France are looking to solutions to the problem of war. Their ultimate goal in the end is the same, to stop war. However, they're going about it in very different means. Wilson, through removing the causes of war and therefore hopefully meaning war will not be an option or will not be as appealing, and Clemenceau through making it impossible for Germany to declare war by putting them in such a weak position. Regardless, with these two men as two of the key leaders in the Paris Peace Conference, compromise would need to be made in order to get anything done. And the man who would work out many of these compromises was the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George. George sought a middle ground, not treating the Germans or the other other ones they had fought as harshly as the French wanted, nor as easily as the Americans wanted. His position reflected the British position of losing quite a lot of men, but their economy, their homeland, remaining relatively stable. In reality, Britain's main concern at this war was the maintenance of their empire and the supremacy of their naval fleet. Aside from that, he was happy to negotiate and get other things happening. It didn't really bother him. At the end of the conference, when he was asked about his opinions on how well he'd done in achieving fair treaties, he was quite positive. He's quoted as saying this, that considering he was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon, he hadn't done too badly. In this analogy, Jesus Christ was Wilson and his idealism of peace, world peace, and unity of everyone working together. And Napoleon was Clemenceau's determination to punish Germany. So the Big Five had arrived in the Paris Peace Conference desiring a way to stop war. The French aimed to do that by crushing the Germans into the ground. The Americans by removing the root causes of war. Either may have worked, but instead, what we get in the treaties is a compromise that was necessary in order for agreement, but a compromise that ultimately weakens and fundamentally ruins the opportunity for these treaties to actually be effective in accomplishing what they set out to do. We know as countries like Germany and the other defeated parties were not invited to the treaty negotiation and were only presented with the treaties and told sign, we know that will have ongoing problems politically in Germany and will again add to this stabbed in the back myth that Hitler and the Nazi Party will push. So what we want to do now is to have a little think about what these treaties were, some basic information, and what they stipulated for the various nations involved. Now, there is a way we can generally remember the requirements of these treaties on the defeated parties, and that is through the acronym BRAT. B for blame, R for reparations, A for armaments, and T for territorial provisions. Generally speaking, these are the four stipulations that the various treaties gave to the defeated parties. So let's have a look through the 5 major treaties signed. The first of which is the Treaty of Saint-Germain. This was signed on the 10th of September 1919 with Austria. Now, Austria needed to accept blame and responsibility for the war. In terms of its reparation payments, that is, repayments, a fine effectively for their involvement in the war that would go towards paying pensions and damages, particularly in France, but other nations that had been affected. Austria agreed to reparations payments, so that was going to occur, but Austria became bankrupt. They ran out of money, and so reparation payments were never actually taken. In terms of their army, their navy was completely terminated, and their army significantly reduced to an army of only 30,000, all volunteers, so conscription abolished. Territorially, Austria lost 60% of its pre-war territory. Now, the treaty with Hungary was called the Treaty of Trianon. It was signed on June the 4th, 1920, and had similar provisions to the Treaty of Saint-Germain signed with Austria. Hungary, too, needed to accept blame for the war. Reparation payments, again, were agreed upon. However, Hungary also became bankrupt before any reparation payment amount could be agreed upon. In terms of their armaments, Hungary lost both their navy and air force and were allowed a slightly larger army than Austria of 35,000 volunteers. Territorially, they lost a similar amount of land to Austria. About 2/3 of their pre-war territory was taken away from them. The Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria, signed on the 27th of November 1919. This one's a little bit different in that Bulgaria does not need to accept blame for the war. Reparations are set at 90 million British pounds. The army would be reduced to 20,000 and the air force and navy to be disbanded. Territorially, Neuilly resulted in Bulgaria losing less territory than either Austria or Hungary, around 1,500 square kilometers of land ceded. However, a lot of it was quite significant, industrially significant land, along with access points to the Black Sea. The Treaty of Sevres was signed with the Ottoman Empire on August 10th, 1920. Again, the Ottomans did not have to accept blame for the war. There were harsh restrictions in terms of their armaments, no reparation payments. However, territorially, the treaty resulted in the complete dissolving and dividing of the Ottoman Empire. It was to be divided up and split. In fact, the Turkish War of Independence, which happens at basically the same time, will see the Treaty of Sevres basically never being fully implemented as Turkey gains independence and is not seen as responsible in any way for the war. A new treaty is signed, the Treaty of Lausanne, which is far less harsh on the Turkish than it had been on the Ottomans, and much of the territory which had been going to get taken off the Ottomans is given back to the Turkish. But the last treaty, and probably the one that is most significant to our study in this unit, is of course the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28th, 1919 in the Palace of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors with Germany. Germany, remember, not invited to the Paris Peace Conference, presented with papers to sign, agreed upon by the various members of the Paris Peace Conference, and despite all objections, Germany in no position to deny them signatures. So, Germany had to accept blame under what's called Article 231 of the War Guilt Clause, which just effectively says that Germany is responsible for the war. That is important because if Germany is responsible, then repayments and whatnot can be meted out. Those reparations were set at 132 billion gold marks, which is a truly exorbitant amount of money. In terms of their armaments, a significantly reduced army, considering Germany had one of the larger armies prior to the war, of 100,000 men, no air force, and only a small navy, which included no submarines, resulting actually in a massive wave of unemployment in Germany. And lastly, territorial losses of 1 million square miles of Germany's most productive land in terms of its economy, 6 million subjects, the Polish corridor, which will divide up various parts of Germany in two, the Saarland being given to, the Rhineland, being demilitarized, and Germany left without a lot of its most productive and industrialized land. And so we can see that the treaties that were signed at the end of the Paris Peace Conference were a bit of a hodgepodge. They were neither so harsh as to completely crush Germany, nor so soft as to negate any desire the Germans might have for revenge later on. They reflect the competing interests of the Big Five, and they have lasting impacts on the whole world. So let's take some time to consider those impacts now. And we're going to start with Germany. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles completely undermined the Weimar Republic, and it led to the rise of extremism on both the left and the right in Germany. Hitler, in particular, preached the stabbed in the back myth that the Weimar Republic had in some way betrayed Germany. Now, we know that this isn't true and that all leadership in Germany recognized that surrender was necessary during the Armistice agreements, and that Germany was in no position to actually refuse signing the Treaty of Versailles, and they didn't have a choice. Regardless, the myth remained. It arguably, particularly with the reparations and the territorial losses, led to, or at least contributed strongly to the 1923 hyperinflation. That we will look at in a later video. Historians are somewhat split on this, on the impact on Germany. Was the treaty actually too harsh, or was it relatively reasonable? The German historian Detlev Pulert makes a valid point which is worth thinking about. And his point is, it's not actually that the peace is impossible, that the terms of the treaty were so unreasonable as to make life impossible in Germany. However, it was the perception, how this treaty was viewed in Germany, and how extremists, like the Nazis and Hitler in particular, were able to use the Treaty of Versailles as propaganda victories for their various ideological agendas. Now, in the US of A, political differences and political separation between the president, who was a Democrat, and the Republican-controlled Congress, meant that the Treaty of Versailles was never ratified, and that America would never join the League of Nations, despite the fact the League of Nations was the president's brainchild. The US never joined it, fundamentally weakening the League of Nations right from the outset, and fundamentally weakening the strength of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, in Italy, the failure of the Italian democratic government to achieve its territorial aims contributed to the failure of democracy in Italy. It allowed Mussolini to point to the failings of democracy, and it allowed for the growth of fascism and the disappearance of democracy in Italy. The map there showing quite clearly in light green the parts of Austria-Hungary that had been promised under the Treaty of London to Italy, along actually in orange with the parts that had been promised to Serbia. None of these were actually given. Now, Japan had entered the conference as one of the big five, but it had been sidelined. Was that because of their relatively small involvement, or was that because of issues over racism? But the Allies' refusal to accept the terms, the desires of Japan at the at the Paris Peace Conference led to the increasing growth of militarism in Japan that sought solutions to their problems. If the world would not work with them to allow them to achieve their goals, then they would achieve them without the world's approval, which would eventually result in the Japanese leaving the League of Nations following their invasion of Manchuria. A point there to note is that the major reason, the second of Japan's desires, at the Paris Peace Conference, that of a recognition of racial equality within the League of Nations failed, was because of the Australian contingent led by Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who adamantly refused any idea of racial equality. This is at a period of time where Australia had a White Australia policy, which stipulated only white people were allowed to immigrate to Australia. And the Australians were very much against, therefore, anything which could potentially undermine that policy. The British, therefore, had to go along with it because they wanted to keep the Commonwealth united together, and the Australian contingent were able to get enough support that although the vote for racial equality actually passed, so many countries didn't show up that they didn't have quorum and the vote didn't count. And so there we've worked our way through the Paris Peace Conference. We've seen how the situation at the end of the war necessitated Germany in signing an armistice that they had very little opportunity to negotiate with. They were forced to sign it. We've seen how the formation of the Paris Peace Conference and the formation of these treaties came down to the Big Five and ultimately really to compromises made between the British, the French, and the Americans over their various competing interests, that although they all agreed on the concept of somehow achieving peace, they had very different ways of going about that. And the treaties we see as a result that assign blame, reparations payments, armaments reductions, and territorial losses, they are a byproduct of those compromises. They are a byproduct that is seen and pointed to in places like Germany and Italy and Japan, countries that will become the Axis during World War II, as problematic, as the cause of a lot of the country's problems, as something to rail against and raise nationalist ire against. And that is where we end our deep dive into the Paris Peace Conference.